High food prices continue to suffocate consumers as we shift into 2023. Food inflation in South Africa is currently above 12%. That is significantly above the 7.4% headline inflation number currently. Why are food prices stubbornly high, and can consumers expect any kind of reprieve later this year? Well, Chief Economist at Agbiz Wandile Sihlobo joins me to answer that question and more. Thank you very much for your time this afternoon, Wandile. So 2022, as we'll all remember, was a very difficult year, with everything from bread and cereals to meat climbing faster than consumers could afford. One would have thought that with overall inflation slightly dipping, food would also become affordable. Are we different from the other parts of the world in this regard?
Absolutely not, because what we saw in South Africa is similar to what we saw in other parts of the world. And in fact, if you look at other countries, the EU, Brazil, parts of the US, actually happen to see much higher food price inflation than what we experienced in South Africa. And there's a number of reasons that were driving food prices. It was not only the Russia-Ukraine story, which came into February last year. Before that, we had drought in South America, Brazil and Argentina, major producers of grains and oilseeds. We also had dry weather conditions in Indonesia, which is an important player when we think about vegetable oil, main producer of palm oil. China was also buying a lot of grains and oilseeds, pushing up global prices. Then early last year, you had then the Russia-Ukraine war starting to add already in that environment of relatively higher food prices. And I think this is what you saw pushing up food prices across the world, and adding on that, of course, the supply chain issues that were related to COVID-19. Now, this is why in South Africa, even though we had fairly good agricultural seasons, you didn't see food prices responding to that. It was more of a global story than what was happening domestically.
On a local front, are there any local factors that are keeping our meat prices higher? I see, for example, the rising meat prices rising at around 10%.
Yeah, I mean, on the local front, I think if you look now at the data that we have for the 11 months of last year, and in fact, we think that for 2022, you will see food price inflation in South Africa averaging somewhere around about 9%. Fairly high when you compare that with the previous few years for the reasons of the factors that I've just described. Meat, though, was one of those products, as you rightly say, and we struggled a lot from a domestic front with what we call a foot and mouth disease, which was affecting the livestock industry. Ordinarily, that disease would lead to many countries blocking our exports, and then you would in turn see the supply of meat remaining domestically and pushing prices low. But last year, that disease had spread to so many provinces that farmers had to reduce the head of cattle that they were slaughtering. So that was one of those factors that we saw pushing up meat prices. But I do think that in as far as the increases, the worst is over from last year. When we look and think about this year, we think that food prices will be rising at a much softer pace compared to what we have last year. We currently have, for example, around about 6% this year. And if you compare that with 2022, which is the number I was talking about 9% on food price inflation.
Wandile, farmers also just recently have been complaining about load shedding, but they're also unhappy about the proposed tariff increases from Eskom. Is this a big factor? I would assume that it is, because I spoke to the CEO of Astral Foods just about 5 minutes ago, and he says they can only subsidize or rather provide reprieve to its clients and customers for so long before those costs filter on to the end user. What are your thoughts on their concerns?
I mean, I think the electricity crisis in South Africa is a major challenge for all of the businesses. In agriculture, not only just the issue of the increase on a tariff, but the reliability of the supply of electricity is also one of those major issues. And in fact, this is why I'm making a point of saying food price inflation this year could average at around about 6%, even though we have this high base effect of 9% of 2022. One of the reasons for that is, of course, we worried that companies might not be able to pass on even the decline that we will see in agricultural commodity prices to the consumer, because last year they absorbed a lot of the increases that we saw, which is why South Africa didn't face higher food price inflation like other parts of the world. And secondly, you have these energy challenges, which I think they will also continue to put pressure on farmers and those that are in the food manufacturing space. So this is one of those worrying issues. But I think with the data that we have so far and what we expect on the farming sector, we still think that the food prices will be rising at a much softer pace. But the input costs for those that are producing food and the farmers will likely remain fairly high for some time.
So you've given us that part of the outlook, but the overall picture for 2023 here in South Africa at the moment, we're still at the mercy of those geopolitical events that you've spoken about a little earlier. But one would assume that weather patterns are going to be a little bit more of a problem for us, particularly with what we saw happening with the floods in KZN in April of last year.
Absolutely. The weather conditions have been a challenge for farmers. I mean, if I look around South Africa, I was just driving around during the December holiday, and it seems to me that some of the other areas are a month behind their typical planting period, particularly if you think about the western parts of South Africa and even the southern parts around about Free State, certain sections of Eastern Cape and KZN. So there will be a delay in the season. But I think overall, we're likely to have a relatively good agricultural season in as far as the output. Even in the livestock industry, there's been now increased attention on biosecurity, which is linked to animal diseases like foot and mouth, which I was mentioning. So on an output perspective, I think it will be fairly good this year. But the reality, though, is that farmers have planted and did all of what they've done for the past season with fairly higher input costs, mainly fertilizer, fuel, and agrochemicals. So that is going to squeeze the profitability on their end. But I think in as far as the availability of food in South Africa, we will remain in better shape as a country. And for consumers, the rate at which food prices will be increasing is going to be much softer than what we saw last year, all things being equal.
Thank you very much. A little bit of encouraging news there in terms of the softer pace at which food prices will be increasing. Wandile, thank you very much for your time this afternoon. That is Wandile Sihlobo from Agbiz, chief economist there, giving us an outlook for food prices in 2023 and the biggest factors that could impact them.